Hello, I'm Gwenydd Jones of the Translators studio. We specialise in teaching the art of translation. In this video, I interview John Worne, the CEO of the Chartered Institute of Linguists, the CIOL, about the CertTrans exam. That's the Certificate in Translation, the Level 6 translation qualification offered by the Institute. This is the second time we've spoken about the CertTrans, and in this interview we talk about the results of the first cohort of translators who sat the exam, and we discuss lots of tips to help you pass first time. If you don't know anything about the exam, it would be a good idea to start by watching our other interview where we talk about the CertTrans in detail. Link in the show notes. Translators, I give you John Worne. John, we're here today following the results of the first sitting of the CertTrans exam from the Chartered Institute of Linguists. But before we get into that, for anybody who isn't quite sure what the CertTrans exam is, could you give us a very brief explanation?
Yes, the CertTrans is a great qualification for people who want to become translators. So it's set around about degree level, which in the jargon is known as level 6. And not only excellent for someone who wants to be a translator, but also really worth looking at for someone who wants to work in an international organization or will be working with texts in an international context. So it's a great qualification for someone who's either starting out or in the early part of their career.
For anybody who's interested in finding more details about the exam, John and I have another interview where we talk about that in a lot of detail, and so I'm going to link to that in the show notes, and I'll also provide a link to the Chartered Institute of Linguists website where you can find all of the latest information about the CertTrans. So, the results have just come out. What can you tell us about the general results from the first sitting of the CertTrans?
Well, look, it's been a very, very successful first round. I mean, I think we have to acknowledge that it was a great cohort. So a very, very strong cohort, very, very well prepared. Some of them were your candidates, I believe, Gwen. So a very, very strong cohort. But the pass rate was very nearly 80%, which is pretty much unprecedented, I would say, for a CIOL qualification. And I think that speaks to what we hope this qualification would achieve. Obviously brings something of value to candidates because it is proof of translation ability, which absolutely we can already see on LinkedIn. People are adding to their profiles and will absolutely make the difference with employers. But also I think because we are the Chartered Institute of Linguists, we wanted it to bring something to the whole languages community. So to people who provide courses, obviously to employers, and it seems to have done all of those things, obviously at small scale at the moment, but we're very, very optimistic for this qualification going forward.
Yeah, we were very pleased at our end. We had some very happy translators. We had quite a few distinctions even coming through, and so the results were great over at the Translators studio. And I really like what you're saying about it. It's not only being for translators, it's a language, it's a qualification to show a certain level in language. It can be used to diversify, to do all different types of work.
Yes, I mean, just to build on that, if I may,
Yeah.
when we say, sometimes people hear early career and think young. That's absolutely not how the CertTrans candidates are. Very, very spread in terms of ages. So it's people at all ages and stages who are taking it. So it's more a reflection of where you are in terms of your career, whether you might have a portfolio of activities, how specialized you are. And also, of course, the CertTrans is great for people who are perhaps wanting to add an additional language to their conventional pair. So we could see all the different sorts of candidate types, people who wanted to work for organizations, people who are starting out, people who are adding, and indeed some people who are doing it just for the joy of proving their own ability.
Yes, we've seen, we're preparing most of our translators for the long game. They eventually want to get to the DipTrans, which is the next level of exam, which I'll also link to our interview about that. But they've found it great as a stop-off along the way, as a way to get something on their CV, because they know that the DipTrans is a longer game. And just also to boost their confidence and allow them to have that qualification there to say, oh, no, here it is. They didn't have a language qualification, perhaps. And it's allowed them to add something really solid to the CV.
Yes, I mean, just on that, I would say that, in a way, qualifications maketh the translator, because I think when somebody has a high quality professional qualification, it gives them so much more confidence in their conversations with clients, in their conversation with agencies, and just in terms of their general feeling about themselves. I think you can see obviously in the joy that people have on LinkedIn, but also I think you can see it in the onward consequences for people because they don't have a niggling doubt in their minds. I think the thing with languages is that, of all the skills that human beings have, it's the one that you tend to possibly be most self-deprecating about. So, people always feel they could be better. And I think having a qualification says, well, yes, of course you could be better, but you're already pretty good.
From the CIOL's perspective, was the CertTrans a complete success? Are there any changes that you're planning to make based on your learnings from this first session?
Well, I can't think of anything that we'd want to change, to be honest with you. Candidates took to it very, very well. Everyone was happy in terms of the platform. The results have been great. The take up has been good. The range of languages were all taken, and all the combinations. So probably the only thing that I would hope for in the future is to increase the number of language combinations. So it would be great to see more languages. We do now have an expressions of interest form on the website for people to tell us about in what timescale and in what languages they might want the CertTrans. So I think that would be the one thing that I would hope for the future, to have more languages available, because five, clearly there are other languages that people are interested in. You can already see that.
Just for anyone watching, what are the 5 languages?
Arabic, Chinese, French, German, and Spanish.
And that's into and out of English in
Into
both
and out of,
directions.
yeah.
So today's interview is entitled How to Pass the CertTrans. So to start off, what would you say that all of the passing translators have in common?
Well, I think ultimately this is about the fundamental pillars of translation. Is it accurate? Is it appropriate? And of course, because this is an exam situation, is it done in an appropriate time frame? So I think the feedback and from what we can see from candidates' performance in the first round, time probably didn't weigh as heavily on them as it does in the DipTrans, where time I think is the ticking clock is a bigger factor for people because the texts are a little shorter and are a little more accessible. But nevertheless, in exam conditions, it is always a different thing than when you're doing something without that sort of pressure. But it is the classic things: accuracy, register, and appropriately rendering the text. So yeah, I think it isn't rocket science on one level, but nevertheless, preparation is going to be the key, I think.
And how long would you say that your average linguist needs to prepare for the CertTrans?
Well, this is a bit of a how long is a piece of string question. Certainly, I think someone who hasn't, for example, taken on board what we say in the study guide, hasn't thought about or learnt about the norms and conventions of translation, and just takes a piece of text and thinks they should, render it in their language. So let's say someone who'd just taken an undergraduate languages degree and felt that a reasonably, broad translation of something would do the job. That would be a miss. That would be a mistake. So I think you would need to have understood what translation is about and what the expectations are that go with translation. So I think I would feel that we will be talking weeks and months of preparation, for anyone to take this on. But I don't think, depending obviously on the starting level, I don't think we'd be talking years of preparation.
One of the points of confusion that I've encountered with the people who do our courses, with the people who are thinking about their progression, is a point of confusion saying, okay, well, if I can pass the CertTrans, then I'll be ready to, I'll be an advanced translator, I'll be ready to go on and do the DipTrans. Would you say this is true? Once a translator's passed the CertTrans, can they call themselves an advanced translator?
Well, I think they can certainly be confident that they are a competent translator. That's exactly what the qualification shows, and that's exactly what the standard is. I think, though, the DipTrans does set a higher bar, and the DipTrans basically, if you talk to people who have been successful in it, I think it's the whole area of having had a lot of experience. So if you've been doing translation work for a few years, then you've encountered a lot of different sorts of text. You've worked around a lot of different translation problems. You're probably quite well networked and understand how other translators approach various issues. And as a consequence, you go into the DipTrans with an appreciation of what professional translation is about. And I think that's probably the difference. The appreciation of what professional translation is about, and also fundamentally the difficulty in the texts. The DipTrans texts are harder. They have much more nuance. They have much more lyricism in some cases. They also have more technical constructions. So I think they are significantly more challenging than the CertTrans texts. So I would say that probably the way to think about it is the CertTrans is a great stepping stone towards, but it isn't instantaneously saying you're now DipTrans ready.
Thinking about exam resources, what is the minimum set of books that a translator should buy if they're planning to do the CertTrans?
CertTrans, I think it's a couple of good dictionaries. So I think that's the starting point. Bilingual and monolingual. So I think that would be fundamentally what we would be about. Um, the guidance, whilst obviously we are testing people's vocabulary and range, the guidance would tend to steer markers and setters away from specific challenges around terminology. So that isn't necessarily a thing to worry about so much. And also, the texts are comparatively functional, so they're not, really highly specialized. So even in the business and the government texts, they're not highly specialized. So my feeling is that good dictionaries should be adequate. Of course, it's all about the amount of preparation and indeed, how much people feel they can invest. But I think good dictionaries is the baseline.
It's a good start. Your basic bilingual and your two basic monolinguals. The other thing is for the translators, a lot of them who are thinking about the DipTrans in the longer term, it's dictionaries are bought, that investment is made, they can then consider expanding their collection when they move forward to the DipTrans.
I think that's a very nice way of putting it. Yes.
And what about doing past papers? Would that be a good way to prepare for the exam?
Yes, past paper is absolutely essential, as we know, and there's nothing like actually sitting down and doing a past paper in exam conditions. One of the sort of classic things that I think we can all do is look at a past paper, sort of skim it, read it, and form an assessment of it. But you can't beat actually sitting down and doing it in terms of finding out where the knotty problems lie within it. So I think that is great. In terms of past papers, we are very, very keen to have more past papers available in the future. So that's definitely something we're committed to doing. And as more of them become available, we will put them on our website and make sure that course providers such as yourself have them. So that's a definite. In terms of preparation, we're talking about in many ways accessible journal articles. So obviously anything which is newsworthy. I'm thinking sort of Time, Economist, those sorts of articles, National Geographic. They're all very good materials to practice on. And one of the things that I know you've asked me in the past, which is, would people be given official documents or official forms? That's not what it's about. We're talking about we're talking about prose. We're talking about a set text, and also for the CertTrans, it will always be a text that's been written by someone for us. So it won't be a piece of journalism or a piece of scientific writing. So it will be written in a way which is stretching, but not setting out to test people to the outer limits of their translation ability.
Yes, because that's one of the interesting points about the CertTrans compared to the DipTrans is in the CertTrans, it is the CIOL that is commissioning the papers, so you're
Exactly.
creating them yourselves. Could you give me a bit of insight regarding the guidance that your writers are asked to follow when they're creating the papers?
Well, basically, we're inviting people to provide something which is stretching and contains challenge and contains some, vocabulary and grammatical and idiomatic complexity, but that is firmly and squarely aimed at the level 6 degree level, or in Common European Framework of Reference CEFR terms at C1.
Hmm.
So there's absolutely acceptance that there can be some errors, there can be some mistakes, there can be some less perfect rendering of text, and that will be taken into consideration. And very much the marking approach is to reward people for what they can achieve, not punish them for what they maybe fall short on. So it's a more positively framed marking approach as well, which is representative of the level that this is set at. It's set at degree level, not at the higher level of the DipTrans. So yes, we give people uh, the steer is to pitch it appropriately for the level that people are taking, and not excessively challenging.
Yeah, I think it's important to underline that positively framed marking approach, which is it's
Yes.
quite technical vocabulary, but it's very important attitude change, I would say, from the CIOL, that you're now approaching the exams from this more positive perspective, which I just think it's generally more encouraging for everybody involved in the entire process.
Yes, and I think that is, that wouldn't just be us. I think that would be a general change
Yeah.
in higher education in the
Hmm.
last 15 to 20 years, which is a move away from finding fault to giving credit, if you like. And I think it is a mindset shift. So I do think, and it's particularly the case for this qualification, because we are seeing this as a step on a journey,
Hmm.
and and a significant step on a journey, but it's not the end state for people. So I think it's important that we encourage and reward them for what they are achieving, whilst also making clear that it needs to hit the standard that that means an employer or an agency or a client can be confident in what the person can do.
If we get into the weeds a little bit now
Mm.
about the different options in the exam, the first paper is a general paper.
Yes.
What sort of subject matter can candidates expect under that general title?
Well, let me just give you a quick run through on that. So basically, what we can expect in the first one is 500 words, appropriate for the educated general reader. Variety of difficulties may include cultural references, idioms, similes, metaphors, colloquialisms, humor, and figures of speech. But basically, it will be a text that is suitable for an educated general reader and should not have complex or specialized vocabulary or terminology in it.
In the DipTrans, the general paper tends to be well, it tends to be an editorial paper. There's kind of an opinion-based paper taken from a quality newspaper. Is the general paper in the CertTrans similar to that in any way?
Um, I would say that it is, and I keep on using this term functional, but you know, I think it is not about excessive journalistic flourish or complexity, or indeed major injection of style that you might associate with different sorts of publication. We
Hmm.
are talking a text which is more functional, so it will use normal straightforward language to get across something. So I mean I've used this example before, it may not come across, but basically we're talking about a piece of text which will describe real world phenomena. So, might talk about climate change and the effect it's having on people. Might talk about, particular geopolitical issues, but it's not going to ask them or talk about them in complicated terminology rich ways. It will talk about them in ways which will use functional and regular vocabulary.
So a normal sort of text on a topic of general knowledge or general
Exactly.
interest.
General interest or general knowledge. Exactly that. Nicely put.
And in terms of the content, will the content relate to the country in question? So if it was a Spanish source text, is it likely to be about Spain or a Latin American country?
No. They'll be standardized, and again, that goes to the way you described it a minute ago. That in effect, we're not pushing for particular context. We're pushing for or specific knowledge. We're pushing for do people have the core essentials of a broad and comprehensive vocabulary, a good understanding of different grammar and tenses, and accuracy and attention to detail. That's what we're effectively testing.
So if we're thinking about the Common European Framework, it's sort of what you might expect in a C1 level reading exam.
Yes, I think that's a very reasonable place to pitch it. Yeah.
And so if somebody is thinking about creating a glossary
hmm
to help them, what kind of terminology or what kind of words could they be looking to put in that glossary?
I mean, current affairs and general global phenomena. I mean, things like, for example, the environment, climate change, geopolitics, culture, but none of that to the degree where we will be expecting, specifics of complex terminology. So I honestly feel that glossary building may not be the biggest challenge here. That it may be more a case of understanding what translation is, making sure that the accuracy is there,
Mhm.
and I guess fundamentally asking yourself the question at the outset, do you feel and have you some evidence from either the world of work or from your study that you can translate to a professional standard? And that's the primary question to ask oneself.
I mean, we can talk about in professional standards some basic issues that I see again and again on our courses, just simply miscopying someone's name, for instance,
Mm,
which for a professional translator is absolutely unacceptable. If you can't copy, how are you going to be able to to change something?
yes,
And so looking more at those kind of technical aspects, or not
yes,
technical,
and
just, I mean,
I
copying.
mean, I suppose the place where people might go wrong with the CertTrans would be, let's say, for example, someone who has recently completed an undergraduate degree but hasn't done translation in it. Someone who is bilingual and does a or substantially bilingual and basically does a sort of a scratch translation, and I think those would be the sorts of situations where people would perhaps come up a little bit short. I think you would want to be confident that someone knew how to translate, you know, was careful in the word for word and wrestled with the choices that you make between languages in terms of the vocabulary and tenses that are available and the different ways in which they work. So I think those would be the sorts of issues that you would be looking to see. I, as I say, I don't think that terminology is the biggest obstacle here.
And before we move on to talk about the papers 2 and 3, do you have any other tips that you'd like to add for preparing for success in the general paper?
No, I don't think so. Other than the classics, which are always good to block out time, always good to to sort of plan ahead, and the other big one is um, set yourself up on the day in a way that is going to help you and without distractions or other things that are going to get in the way. So I don't think there's any secret recipe to this. Just preparation and practice. And I think as I'm sure you would say to your candidates, there is no substitute for sitting down with a piece of text and and translating basically.
Papers 2 and 3. Paper 2 is business and commercial translation skills, and paper 3, government and public service translation skills.
Yep.
And when the translator signs up for the CertTrans, they have to choose one or the other one. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so one of the questions that I've been asked is, I don't know which one to choose. What advice would you give to somebody who isn't clearly leaning towards one option or the other?
I mean, I don't think that it is such a dramatic choice as all of that. I think which is not in any way to trivialize it, but I think what we're talking about here is largely a question of register. So, a business, the business or commercial might be a bit more how you would speak to a consumer, how you would speak to, to a lay audience, how you would, make something interesting and gripping, if you like. Whereas the public service and government one is going to be a little bit more formal, a little bit more official, a little bit more, perhaps factual, and perhaps a little drier. So I think it's more about the style of the two papers. And I guess the subject matters, might be a bit more marketing on the business side, might be a bit more, policy on the government and public service side. But I would like to think that someone who had a leaning in either direction could, without much difficulty, be successful on the other paper. I don't think it would be, a determining factor for someone which way they chose.
And what sorts of texts should the linguist be reading or translating to prepare for these two options?
I'd say again the same sorts of things. I mean, we're talking general texts, obviously public policy issues, and we'd be talking about generic public policy issues like, I don't know, climate, fuel, law and order, migration. So those are the sorts of topics that you might see, but again, not in terms of the finer details of the public policy issues therein. We're talking about the more general phenomena and comparatively straightforward in general terminology about them. Then on the business side, social media, communications, marketing sorts of issues, the sorts of things that perhaps a description about a business and what sort of products and sales it has, those sorts of things. But again, not highly specific. We're not going to get into the details of windscreen wipers and exhaust pipes and spark plugs. It's more the automobile industry is growing or declining, or those sorts of things.
I'm guessing for the business, perhaps a bit of financial terminology around being able to understand the basic words used
Yeah,
to talk about it
growth
in
and
business.
profits and turnover, those sorts of terms might be useful. Quite, whereas I guess the economy, statistics, policy, maybe for the other one.
So I'm really hearing that in general terminology wise, we're working with what you can find in a general dictionary.
Hmm.
So if a translator wants to build up a glossary for this exam, where would you say don't bother, or where would you tell them to focus?
Well, I think if someone was to, I mean, setters are people like you and me. So setters receive guidance and have clear parameters, but they have to inspire themselves to come up with a piece of text which is interesting and relevant. So they are obviously going to be influenced by what's happening at the moment and what
Mhm.
the issues of the day are. So if you were to look at, for example, the DipTrans paper from 30 years ago, it was probably talking about slightly different things than a DipTrans paper of today. So I think, to the extent that someone is reasonably aware of what's happening in the world, takes an interest in news and current affairs, then that can't do any harm, and those will be good texts to work on because it's highly likely that the texts are going to deal with things that are of interest in major economies and in major countries around the world.
In terms of practicalities of the exam, we've already mentioned that it's a very good idea to get on the platform before the day and
Yes.
practice using it, and do a mock exam there. Do you have any other further tips regarding preparing for the practicalities of the exam?
Yeah, I mean, I do think that's really surprisingly important. I mean, having seen a lot of exams and footage of exams and assessments, over the years, since the move to online, probably the most surprising thing of all is people who've not set themselves up, in a particularly helpful way for themselves. So, sometimes people say that to have space for their papers and to have space for dictionaries is quite helpful. So sometimes people choose a slightly larger working area than is the one they work in typically, to make sure you've got plenty of space. Obviously, many of us have families and pets and other things. I mean, at the end of the day, this is an exam. If it is a professional exam, so I think setting yourself up and avoiding to the greatest extent possible things that are going to interfere with you and interrupt you on the day. And then the other thing is that I do think necessarily most people will have anxiety just before the exam starts. So I think if you've not been on the platform and done the kind of preparatory checks and had a little play with it, then I think you are doing yourself a disservice because inevitably, as it's 5 minutes to 2 minutes to 1 minute to countdown, the adrenaline starts to kick in, and you sometimes people make slight mistakes or panic a bit, when they first get on. And we always help people through it, but
Yeah.
I do think that to the extent that you can be calm and perform, that's always helpful. So I would recommend a bit of care with setup, and I have been surprised sometimes at the ways that people have set themselves up.
I remember one of our DipTrans students, she actually went to a neighbour's house to sit the exam because she just knew that it wasn't going to be quiet in her own house, and that was how she got around the problem.
I think that's it. I think that's exactly it. Just thinking through what could happen and just how disruptive it's going to be. And people have made a big investment of both money and
Yeah.
time to sit it. And I just think it's one of those things, isn't it, that as we've all become so used to working online, and you sort of sit with a tidy piece of backdrop behind you, and then around you is your life. Sometimes you can forget that you may not be putting yourself in the best psychological situation. So I think it is a special day. Mark it in the calendar and see if you can prevail on those around you to leave you in peace and help you to be successful.
Just to close this interview, I'd like to ask you for a top tip. What is your top tip for someone who wants to pass the CertTrans first time?
Top tip for passing it first time. I mean, I would say read the study guide, and then if you can afford it, get some help from a professional like you, because even if it's just even if you can't afford a full course of study, I just think to appreciate what translation is, and to have the opportunity to just see what's expected from a person who does this for a living is immensely valuable if you can afford it.
That's brilliant. Well, thank you very much for speaking to us today, John.
My pleasure. Really enjoyed it. Thanks, Gwen.
I hope you enjoyed this interview from the Translators studio. We specialise in teaching the art of translation and in preparing translators for certification through the DipTrans exam. If you like our content, please let us know by clicking on the subscribe button. See you in the next video.